Okay, so good morning and welcome to the sixth in a series of weekly webinars. I'm Chris Newell and I'll be your host for today. As the UK makes its first steps out of the lockdown, we continue our series of webinars by considering the tax and spend policies that the government is likely to adopt, as well as the challenges and opportunities businesses will need to address. I'm pleased to welcome back expert speaker Jeremy Mindell this morning. Our webinar today will take the format of a question and answer session where Jeremy will share his thoughts on which sectors are likely to obtain additional support, which tax reliefs will be most useful to businesses in the recovery stage, and which tax issues will remain critical in the months ahead. We will then look ahead to the effect that coronavirus may have on future tax policies. The question and answer function is open on this webinar, so please do feel free to submit your own questions in real time. Many of you have also submitted questions beforehand, and so we will try our best to answer these at the end. Before we kick off, I'd like to ask for your patience if we do experience any technical difficulties at all during the next hour or so. And so without further ado, let me introduce you to Jeremy Mindell. Jeremy has partnered with Quantuma for a number of years to deliver a series of enormously insightful briefings following major fiscal events. Jeremy is a chartered tax advisor and was a senior manager at Deloitte before moving in-house to work at AMP and then Henderson Global Investors. So let's start the discussion. So Jeremy, can you summarise what support is the government giving businesses at the moment?
So if you look at the next slide, the Rishi Sunak re-announced this week what sort of support he's been giving. 2.5 million individuals with the self-employed income support scheme, which is obviously for the self-employed individuals. The much more expensive and extensive scheme of 8.7 million jobs through the furlough scheme, the coronavirus job retention scheme, and about 700,000 small businesses with bounce back loans. And of course, the Bank of England has given very large loans to some of the largest companies in the FTSE 100 as well. So very substantial support, and that's costing a huge amount. And we're talking about 60 billion plus in the borrowing just in 1 month to support that.
Okay, so how is the government proposing to phase out the support over the next few months?
Well, what they're looking to do in terms of phasing it out is closing furlough to new entrants from the end of the month. The employers are going to cover a percentage of costs. They're going to start off by having covered the national insurance and pension costs, and then the percentage of support by the government will be reduced over the months. The scheme is supposed to end in October as we sit at the moment. Having said that, one of the elements which may come up, which will help matters, is the moment furloughing is all or nothing. You either, if you do some work, you cannot be furloughed. So you either have to decide that the employee does nothing or they do everything effectively. There is talk about them allowing part-timers to be part-time furloughed so that you do maybe 20, 40, 60% of the job and the government covers the cost of the rest. But the idea is to wean the economy off government support as the economy is supposed to recover.
Okay, so looking at some specific sectors now, Jeremy, what sectors do you think will emerge stronger and which ones will be under considerable stress going forward?
Well, I think that the sectors that will emerge stronger are the ones which are generally strong before or on a growth path before coronavirus. So things like technology, things like home delivery, things like Zoom, obviously, Netflix, that sort of area which provides electronic services, will obviously see, has seen a huge boost to their customer base. And I anticipate that that will continue. Those that will be under considerable stress, again, I would say you look back to what was under stress before coronavirus. So the high street in particular is going to be a problem. Airlines, we'd seen lots of stress with large numbers of airlines going broke well before coronavirus hit. So you'll see problems in those sorts of areas as well. So I think generally speaking, my view is that coronavirus will accelerate and accentuate trends that they've been in the past, but it generally won't create a U-turn by, with some small exceptions, businesses that were strong before coronavirus will recover quickly, or indeed go from strength to strength, and businesses that were suffering before coronavirus will just be hit that much harder.
Okay. So which tax reliefs, Jeremy, will be most useful to businesses in the recovery stage?
So if you look at the next slide, I've put it in a number of different categories. One of them is obviously loss relief on corporate tax. So a number of companies will be making losses this year. They have the ability to set those losses against profits of the prior year and get corporate tax relief. If businesses go out, if you go out of business, then you've got terminal loss relief, which allows the losses of the last 12 months of trading to be set against the previous 36 months of profits, again getting some reliefs. R&D tax credits. So a lot of companies have had to change, improve their processes. They should be looking very carefully about whether those changes would qualify for R&D tax credits, which could get you anywhere up to 230% of the expenditure as a deduction against corporate tax profits, or you will get a potential cash back, which again can be very useful. VAT refunds, clearly those individuals who, companies which have large expenses which are VATable could be looking at VAT refunds, and therefore should be looking to either move on to monthly VAT returns, or at least make sure their VAT information is up to date and captures their expenses very carefully. If you have to downsize, national insurance relief on termination payments, very important that in terms of termination payments, they do still get some tax and national insurance advantages. One of the differences is you don't get that on payments in lieu of notice anymore. So it's important to differentiate payments in lieu of notice from termination payments, but that relief is still valuable. Retraining reliefs for employees who are no longer able to perform the same duties for you. Those are important, again, tax deductible. And then important to look at, excuse me, time to pay arrangements. So HMRC has already allowed people longer to pay their VAT, but a business in problems could also apply to HMRC for additional time to pay arrangements. And finally, tax relief on share losses. So normal capital gains tax relief if you lose money on shares, but if you are investing in unquoted trading companies and you make losses, you could get income tax reliefs on those as the individual investor. Other elements, obviously, in terms of strategies for helping struggling businesses, incentivizing staff, potentially reducing the debt by waiving loans. Shareholders may do a debt to equity swap, for example. When I talk about incentivizing staff, you could decide that if staff, you want to incentivize staff to be there for the long term, but you don't have the sort of cash available to give them cash bonuses now, maybe an enterprise management incentive scheme or some other form of share scheme to keep them incentivized and motivated for the long term, which are also extremely tax efficient, both in terms of national insurance and income tax and potentially corporation tax. Possibility, obviously, of deferring or cancelling dividends. And that really does lead to the final element, which is restructuring. We're thinking about restructuring. Companies are going to be looking at either potentially selling parts of their business, closing parts of their business, or major restructuring, which changes the focus of their business. And obviously, there is quite a lot of assistance there. Professionals are out in the market who are prepared to assist, with that area. And quite often it's something that companies been mulling over, but coronavirus has suddenly made it more urgent that they do this.
Okay, thank you, Jeremy. So which specific taxes and sectors are likely to be affected?
Well, let's have a look at the different types of, if you look at the next slide, the different types of recoveries. So there's some organizations and businesses that I think will have what we call a V-shaped recovery. You've already seen that with garden centres, where they were allowed to open up at the beginning of May in England, later in Scotland, slightly earlier in Northern Ireland. And they've seen a particularly strong recovery because people are doing more gardening under lockdown. UK seaside, well, we've all seen all the pictures, likely to see, particularly if the weather improves again, a considerably, bounce back. I suspect the hairdressers, I know I'm looking forward to, as my state of my hair shows, to using a hairdresser. I'm sure that they will bounce back very quickly. Entertainment, I think, is more of a U-shaped. It's going to be more of a long haul, especially with social distancing. It will depend on whether the government actually reduces the necessary the distance from 2 to 1 meters. But entertainment is already planning a recovery, but I think it'll be patchy and it'll take longer. Overseas tourism, well, I'm assuming that once some form of easing is there in terms of quarantine and other elements being eased, there will be a bounce back in terms of a number of people who are dying to get away. But I think that it faces longer term problems. And after the initial enthusiasm, I think the reality of the more difficulty of international travel, the hygiene issues, the worries, the fact that I think business travel will not recover to the extent that it was pre-coronavirus, I think that is going to give a problem. L-shaped ones, well, airlines, I think it's difficult to see how they recover easily. As I say, particularly with business travel, that accounts for a disproportionate amount of their profits, and I'm sure companies will be looking to cut their costs there. Large office blocks, will wait and see. Will the increased amount of home working mean that companies are reluctant to go back to large office blocks? Will they set up satellite offices in suburbs? That's what a number of estate agents and property people are talking about. The high street, obviously, considerable issues there. And then the final element of is what I call the I, the areas which have been boosted and I think will continue to be boosted post-coronavirus. So technology, like what we're looking at here, pharmaceuticals, home delivery, and hygiene products, which I think that the increase will just be sustained on an ongoing basis. And I think that the government will be looking in terms of the sectors it's going to support. Things like the steel industry, why would it support that rather than, say, restaurants? Well, problem is you shut a blast furnace, you can't really easily open it up again. There's certain areas like that in the car industry where the government would be worried that if it stops, it isn't going to come back. Whereas there are other sectors where they believe that, weaker companies may go to the wall, like with airlines, and stronger companies will take over. Similarly with restaurants. The area where I think they will give a little bit more support would be, say, pubs, for example, and certain hospitality areas. I think particularly pubs have a particular political and social resonance, so I would expect to see some more support in that area in particular. Particularly with some areas of hospitality, because they employ a disproportionate number of young people, and it's young people being hit really hard, and the government wants to make sure that it can get young people back to work as soon as possible. So in terms, if you look at the next slide, the sort of help that they could be looking at would be selective national insurance contributions holidays on an industry by industry basis. I could see that happening. R&D boost, the government had already been talking about for some time, expanding the areas on which you could get R&D tax credits. And I think that you'll see payment arrangements in certain industries, time to pay arrangements will become even easier from that basis. So my view is that those are the three areas that I would expect. If there was anywhere else, I would expect that the rates relief that was being given for smaller companies would be likely to be maintained longer. I just don't see rates for smaller companies going back to the levels that they used to be. And that actually follows a trend of successive budgets giving greater rates relief.
Okay, thanks, Jeremy. So when and how is all of this going to be announced? I've seen kind of some talk in the press recently about there being an emergency July budget.
Yeah, I mean, has been a lot of talk in the last week of Rishi Sunak doing what he's calling a sort of early autumn statement with some new fiscal measures. I think that there is quite a possibility. Obviously, you know, that's only a month away. And these announcements tend to get postponed. So I don't know it's going to be early July, but I would have thought there will be some indication either just before Parliament goes into recess, which should be at the end of July, or if Parliament is recalled in September, then I think that there would be an announcement in September. But I'm pretty certain the Treasury is working on a package of measures. It wouldn't be a full-blown budget, but it would include additional support for the economy.
Okay. We've had some good questions coming in, so please do keep them coming and we'll cover them towards the end. But going back to some sectors, Jeremy, so which industries are the government likely to support in the short, medium and long term? And what's going to be the government's likely approach?
Well, I think there I would look at sort of by industry. If you look at the sort of ideas that have been done in terms of the way of analysing an industry, this is quite a well-known module. Threat of substitution, interestingly enough, if an industry or if a company can be easily replaced, you know, a bit like Flybe could be easily replaced by a number of other airlines, then I think they're unlikely to support them hugely. And therefore, the sort of threat of new entrants, that sort of element, if there are lots of new entrants and those entrants are domestic, i.e. in the UK, then I think the government will take a more relaxed approach. If, however, the threat of new entrants is overseas and what you're seeing is jobs going abroad, then I think it's much more likely that the government will intervene. And that's why I think the sort of the car industry, the steel industry, tech, that sort of area, the government is very sensitive about and will want to ensure that it supports them. I think that the idea of national champions is coming back, that there's certain areas such as protective equipment, technology, pharmaceuticals, R&D and so on, where the government is going to be much clearer that they will want to intervene and protect those industries. And then in terms of industries which are sensitive, that the government is sensitive about, well, clearly anything that employs a large number of people in a time where we're going to have rising unemployment for a while, government is going to look at temporary measures to support them. My final point would be, if you think there's this Project Birch, it's called, where the government may give very large loans to and support to certain key industries whilst taking a temporary stake in them. You might think to yourself, well, this sounds extremely sort of left-wing. We're back to Tony Benn taking, excuse me, sorry. You're back to Tony Benn and nationalising industries. No, it's not supposed to be like that. It's supposed to be temporary support in exchange for a temporary stake. But I'm sure there'll be conditions in them, in those stakes, you know, bans on bonuses, large dividends, aggressive tax avoidance. There will be conditions, and it'll be interesting to see what happens. I think what you will find that the autumn will be extremely difficult. And that's because the old saying is that from a former head of the Federal Reserve, that when the tide goes out, you find who's been swimming without shorts. And the same will be true in terms of as the government's support for British industry reduces, as they try and cut back on furloughing and other supports they've given, you will then find out which industries cannot cope. And that's why I think it'll be a very difficult autumn. It's generally known that in the recovery stage of a business cycle, that's when more companies go broke. And I expect that to be true in spades in the autumn.
Okay. So, Jeremy, how should stakeholders and outside investors judge the prospects for individual companies and sectors?
Well, I would look at the pestle model, which is not sort of peston, it is pestle. But every industry you would look at, particularly now, politics is back in a big way. I'll look at international trade a bit later on, but you look at how the business or sector is being affected by the political situation, the general economic climate, social trends, for and against different types of businesses, the legal side, the environmental. I think the environment is going to become even more important in terms of global environmental policies, and of course technology. Are you at the cutting edge? Have you got technology that people want? When you look at all of those areas, that should give you a good idea in terms of a checklist about whether A, the sector is going to recover, and B, whether the individual company in the sector is going to recover. And having done that, you're then going to end up with a number of options. Looking at the next slide, you're going to be looking at the different types of options, which is the extreme closing down. Here we have a picture of slightly threatening weather, shall we say. Do you close down? Do you, instead of closing down, which of course has its major costs of redundancy and shutting down and dealing with your legal obligations, do you just try and sell it? Anything, even if you sell a company for nothing, if it's loss-making and has no prospects of you making a profit, if you sell it for nothing, that is better than closing it down. At least you don't have negative costs if you pass on all the liabilities to the purchaser. But there has been a tick up in M&A activity, and you are getting distressed sales. Do you sell part of a business? So restructure like the banks did, the good and bad banks. Do you try and sell part and keep the rest? Do you restructure? And then finally, and restructuring is going to be a whole area about, do you do it by department, geographical area? You look at retail or travel, and a number of them have made announcements about stores that they're not going to reopen, or restaurants. You had the most recent one with Frankie and Benny's. And these are things that I'm sure were under consideration, but coronavirus has very much accelerated their plans. Or finally, do you just batten down the hatches, reduce your costs as much as possible, hope to get through to better times in 2021, 22, depending on the industry you're in? And, for some industries, it really is about battening down the hatches. And if they survive it and their competitors don't, they'll be in a better position in maybe a year to 2 years' time.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. That's a good summary. So do you have a golden rule for assessing companies and decision making?
So I think the first thing is, and actually it was a good piece of advice given by an estate agent, was, do you make a really important decision in the middle of a crisis? And the estate agent was saying, do you want to buy a cottage in North Norfolk now? You've decided you've had enough of London life, you don't like the commuting, you're able to work from home, you think, and the weather's been gorgeous. But the estate agent did say, well, you might want to think about what North Norfolk looks like in winter. Are you happy with the wind and the rain coming off the North Sea and just battening down your hatches for the winter and not seeing very many people? And so making long-term decisions in the middle of a crisis, I think you can make decisions about, sort of whether I invest in the stock market or not, but long-term decisions about companies, you really do need to think about. And if you do have to make those decisions, then, as I say on the next slide, I think you look at the trends before coronavirus. Those, if you've got a trend, coronavirus has accelerated that trend. If you've done a complete U-turn, that's the point at which I start thinking, maybe you should think about it a bit longer. It's a bit like the people who decided, the short-term sellers who decided to short Hammerson's, the property company, and ended up with huge losses as Hammerson's doubled their share price because actually business is starting to recover. There are elements that people need to think about carefully. There will be a world beyond coronavirus, and it won't change everything. Those people who think it will change everything are deluding themselves. Major events tend to accelerate trends they've been before. They don't generally of themselves, except for a few exceptional sectors, create trends that weren't there in the past. We were doing more remote working. We were watching Netflix more. We were doing more conference calls. This has accelerated a trend that was there. It hasn't created a trend that wasn't there in the first place. And then, as I say, if you like, the golden rule of this is what was good will recover. If it was good before coronavirus, it'll be good afterwards. And what was bad before, just say goodbye to, because it isn't coming back.
Okay, thanks, Jeremy. So next question then, how do you think the government will deal with the large deficit created by COVID-19? And if I can weave in a question that's come from Peter, how soon is all of this going to be paid for?
Well, so my view is that this is what I would call in the next slide, the Pandora's box. In other words, there'll be two strategies. One, the government will want to have current spending and current taxation within balance within a relatively short period of time. So what it'll do is it'll take the coronavirus lump and say, well, at the end of the crisis, I want to be back to a situation where my taxes cover my spending. But I think that the debt that sits, that will be accumulated, and we're talking anywhere, sort of the estimates go north of 200 billion towards 300 billion of debt that we will acquire out of this coronavirus. I think they'll put in a box. It's at low interest, and there's going to be no rush to repay it. I mean, it took us over nearly 100 years to repay the First World War debts. War loan was still there for George Osborne, I think, finally repaid it in about 2014 or something. So there won't be a rush to cut spending and increase taxes to repay this debt. I think they'll put it in a box and say this is a special debt. And we will expect economic growth over the years to make this debt less important. But I think what they will do is they'll want to get back to balance in terms of current spending. Not investment spending, they'll still borrow to invest, but I think current spending and current taxes, they'll want to get back within the economic cycle back to balance. If you look at the next slide, one of the issues is that most of the taxes come from income and VAT, their consumption and income. Again, if you raise those, the big revenue raisers, then actually you depress the economy more, and it becomes a bit of a vicious circle. There are no easy ways of raising taxes without hurting the economy, particularly at the delicate stage that it's at now. So I just think that they'll bite the bullet on this, and they'll want to ensure, if possible, that they keep taxes stable. I'm not saying there won't be a few tax rises. I actually think what will generally happen is tax enforcement will become stronger, particularly where companies have taken government support. But I think the room for tax rises without damaging the economy is really quite small.
Okay. So talking about tax, what tax issues will remain critical in the coming months?
So I think what will become really important is, is there any room for the government to claw back some of its ground to get towards a balance in the budget? And what you can see here is actually when you compare it to the OECD, our taxes on property are already higher and the sector is somewhat sickly. Value-added tax, we're already above the average. Personal income profits and gains, we're above the average. So the only area where we're really sort of undertaxing is social security, but you raise social security, you're not encouraging job creation. In a time when we believe unemployment's going to rocket in the autumn, this is not a good idea. And that's why I'm not convinced they're going to raise a great deal. If they do anything, I will think it will be areas of investigation, trying to close a bit further that tax gap of £34 billion by more aggressively going after small and medium-sized companies that they believe are either guilty of tax avoidance or evasion, and for the larger companies looking more aggressively at things like transfer pricing, where they believe that profits are being shifted abroad. If you look at the scale of the challenge on the next slide, you can see that where sort of borrowing has been very much under control since 2015. This is from the Office for National Statistics. Look at the last period from coronavirus and the exponential increase in borrowing. Quite incredible. But what I think they want to do is to bring it back to some sort of balance. They're not looking to repay the debts that we're incurring now in the short or even medium term. And I think one of the big issues, which I'll talk about on the next slide, is reputation. And you're already seeing that in the press this week. Lists of companies that are taking large loans, lists of companies that are taking furloughing. Are they paying all the taxes they should do in this country? You've seen issues raised about certain entrepreneurs who have offshore islands in the West Indies and whether really their companies should get large loans from the taxpayer. That sort of element is coming back in. You're seeing more comments by people like the ex-chair of the Public Accounts Committee, Margaret Hodge, saying, if government companies get support, they better pay back when the time gets good. If you're going to take the Queen's shilling, as I call it, you can expect payback. Very interesting that 2 days ago, The Spectator magazine said it had done better than expected, and therefore it was going to repay all the furloughing and government support it had had. Expect more pressure to companies that have actually done well through this period to repay some of that money. And it'll be very interesting to see how that plays out in the next months. I foresee, just like after the financial crash, there was a big talk about fair taxes and companies having been supported, particularly in the banks being supported in the financial crash, they need to make a contribution back. Because the government has made such a much wider support to a much wider range of industries, again, there'll be public pressure to say, when the good times come back, you're going to have to pay your fair share of taxes. We don't expect to see aggressive tax avoidance.
Yeah, okay. So what do you think the ramifications are for international trade as a result of recent developments?
Well, I think we're now moving on to a much darker position. In terms of protectionism, we're seeing national champions, aid given to large companies, talk about that later on, in return for different undertakings. More industries of national importance. I'm not talking about toilet roll producers, although maybe 3 months ago I would have been. Interestingly, if you think about how normalcy has come back, I noticed when I went to my local shops that there were 2-for-1 offers on toilet rolls again, rather than being at a premium. Interestingly enough, I was talking to a friend who said one of his major surprises was that there'd been so few shortages in the shops, given the extent of the economic disruption. And certainly private industry has risen to the challenge of producing, the shelves have been very rarely bare. And I think that that's a real tribute to our retail and distribution and manufacturing industries. But more industries will be seen as of national importance, need to produce in the country. There'll be more bailouts with conditions. International tension is going up. And it's not just the gentleman in the center of the slide. Joe Biden, if he's elected in November, has a policy no less robust in relation to China than the current president. So a change of president will not change the basic tenets of the US-Russia tensions and the US-Chinese tensions. And I think there'll be shorter supply chains. Companies have looked at the size of their supply chains, and they've seen that they're susceptible to this sort of disruption. And remember, auditors each year, when they look at going concern and so on, are going to ask companies to say, well, if this reoccurs, if the pandemic comes back again, how robust are your supply chains? Which indicates that they're going to be shortened and they'll be reshoring. And then if you look at the protectionism on the next slide, one of the major issues is state aid. We've seen big loans going to airlines, and a huge one by the French government to Renault. And the French government have said, you've got to keep jobs in France as in the terms of the bailout. Now, if everybody does that, then suddenly the single market in the EU does not really exist. Number one, protection of jobs is incompatible with a single market within the EU. And secondly, state aid certainly distorts the market. Some companies getting lavish state aid and other companies deciding they don't need it. So I think very much the government back in the act for good or ill. If I look at the next slide, the other problem I think is international. We are back in politics. If we're talking about, this is from Freedom House, their assessment of free countries, and you can certainly argue in terms of some of them. But the point would be is that beforehand, certainly in the late part of the 20th century, early 21st, people would deal with any country, as long as they got paid effectively. And people were looking less at the political systems because there was this idea, a la Francis Fukuyama, that we were all moving at some pace, some slower, some faster, to a more democratic liberal values, liberal with a small l. What this map shows is the areas in green are free, relatively free areas. And you're seeing a sort of contraction of the world, that the free areas, free countries, will find it easier to deal with other free countries and will think twice about dealing with the countries in blue. The middle color of amber, as you'd expect, are the countries that are partially free. And I think what you will see is greater international tension will mean that globalization is somewhat reversed. And you are going to see companies saying, I'm going to limit my risk and deal with countries I can trust, where I can trust their political systems. And part of that you can already see in the tension in terms of China, Hong Kong, the Sea of China, all those elements. And this, I think, is a big issue. And if you turn to the next slide, it even looks even starker than that when you look at this particular slide in terms of democratically elected governments. I think that this is one of those areas where you're going to have to keep an eye on. And countries and companies in particular are going to have to factor in the political risks much more than they did in the 1990s and the early 2000s.
Okay. So how do you see the UK being positioned in terms of its recovery from COVID-19 and the post-Brexit negotiations on free trade agreements? And a follow-up here, so from Nick. So if we don't get a deal on Brexit, what would the view be on the future of the economy?
Let me go for two reasons why this deal is less likely. One of them is fishing. Now, you might say, well, fishing is a very small part of the country's GDP, but it's tangible, it's very political, it's very visible. And also there's Scottish elections in 2021, and the Conservative seats held are round where the fishing communities are. So the government cannot, and I think will not, compromise too far on fishing. Yes, foreign boats will get some rights, but not at the sort of level that that they have now, or that the EU has been arguing for. And the second element is level playing field. So whereas the Theresa May government was prepared to give ground on following EU regulations, the Johnson government doesn't believe that it should be stymied in any way, restricted in its response to coronavirus and in dealing with the economy. And it believes it wanted Brexit in order to have the freedom to set regulations as they please. And if there isn't significant movement on those two areas, I don't think there's a deal in prospect. In terms of comparative fears for the economy, well, you know, people had a lot of thoughts about what would go wrong with Brexit. And of course, we're in a transition period, but I think that COVID-19 has probably put most of the Brexit fears into some form of perspective. Are you really worrying about an extra minute on your travel at the Channel ports when there might be 14 days quarantine? Are you really worrying about a disruption to supplies when the whole world has been thrown into turmoil? I actually think that this has made a Brexit deal, or the necessity for the British government to do it, in their view, less urgent. And therefore, on that basis, they feel they have less to lose if the country ends up on WTO term rule, trading on WTO terms at the end of December. The other reason why I think a transition period or an extension is very unlikely is not only has the government set its face against it, not only does it have a big majority, which of course it didn't have in the last parliament, but the EU is about to agree a 75, I've forgotten whether it's 75 trillion, but no, 75 billion bailout for its economy. Sorry, 750 billion bailout for its economy, this new fund. And if Britain stays in the transition period, it will need to make a contribution to that new EU fund, which is another reason why Britain will not want to go for transition. It's possible that there will be a limited deal hammered out, but I think it will be a limited deal, and there must be at least a 50% chance of no deal.
Okay. Thanks, Jeremy. So we've got some time now for some further questions, and we've had some questions submitted previously, and quite a few on the live chat, so do keep them coming. I think this is a really interesting one from Jeffrey. So what do you consider is likely to happen regarding the upcoming hearing on the interpretation of insurance policies as regards business interruption claims being brought by the FCA? If the door does open to claims, can the insurance sector manage this? And if not, what do you think the government will do to protect business against unmanageable insurance premiums being charged in the future? Could this be possibly achieved by an increase in insurance premium tax?
So we're talking about companies like Hiscox, for example, who have got a different interpretation on business interruption. I think that the government would only intervene if it looked like there was a systemic risk to the insurance business. If the welter of claims actually made the insurance business unviable, then I think the government would have to intervene. After all, insurance is a big invisible earner for the UK. It's a huge revenue raiser for the government. So I think that if there was a systemic risk to the whole industry, then yes, I agree, the government would intervene, it would provide support, and that would come with strings attached.
Okay, thanks, Jeremy. Another question that's come in. What steps is the government realistically likely to take, if any, to avoid significant future bad debts from borrowers under the Sybil scheme and the bounce back loan schemes?
Well, I think what will happen is, remember that the government had two choices. It could either do a scheme with loads of checks, making sure that none of the money went astray or was misused, in which case we'd still be waiting for the schemes, or it could make its priority setting this thing up and getting money into the hands of businesses as quickly as possible. It took the latter option to do so, and I think probably was right to do so. I think what will happen is, as sure as night follows day, HMRC will set up a unit to probe some of the payments made and will look to reclaim them if they've been made improperly. Now, sometimes when there's been phoenixism, you know, a company's been put into liquidation, that may be too late. But don't overlook the fact that the government does have reserve powers, that if directors have misused funds, they can take away the corporate veil, the corporate protection, and go personally after the directors. So I suspect there will be a unit set up within HMRC in order to look at the monies going out and to get audited records. As I say, that will be once the general COVID-19 emergency is over.
Okay. Another question that's come in from Rob. What do you think will be the impact of cessation of the government furlough scheme?
I think that it will obviously cause companies to say, do I need all these staff? Now the government is not paying for them. Am I going to make people redundant? Am I going to change their terms and conditions? Maybe make people part-time? So I think that you know, some companies will say, why did I need all these people? I furloughed and I can still do certain operations. So I think the end of the furlough scheme will see an inevitable rise in unemployment and an increase in company restructurings, and of course, potential company liquidations as they run out of support.
Okay. A question, sort of follow up to that from Nick. He's advising a lot of companies in respect of large numbers of redundancies, and there is no doubt unemployment is going to rise considerably. Do you think this high level will last for long, or will the economy create jobs again quickly?
I can't see why the economy shouldn't create jobs quickly. I mean, they will be in different sectors, you know, vandalism drivers, more in technology, more cleaning, you know, cleaning companies are going to do particularly well. So as long as we have an overall dynamic economy where it's, you know, the UK is within the top 10 places for ease of both setting up a company and doing business, then I can't see why the UK economy shouldn't bounce back pretty quickly. Some of the sectors where jobs are being lost, like hospitality, for example, you don't need a vast amount of capital to restart. And I can see that coming back. Maybe not quite as strong as before coronavirus, but I would have thought over the medium term, the UK is in as good a position as anywhere else. So there's an economy I would be concerned about. It's economies which rely on large supply chains and export-led. And I think that they may find it more difficult if the international position darkens.
Okay. Another question that's come in from Simon. The immediate capital support of the pandemic is widely noted, but what regard has been given to the elephant in the room with regard to a no-deal Brexit, which seems increasingly more likely? Do you anticipate a new round of restructured current CBILS loans, bounce-back loans to support liquidity of businesses to battle these as yet largely ignored headwinds?
Well, I think that quite a lot of the disruption caused by no deal has already been discounted. Interesting enough, some of the measures that the government put in place when coronavirus hit were measures that they just dusted down, hardly needed to dust down, because they were put in place for a no-deal Brexit. I think that coronavirus will have already probably reduced our susceptibility to supply chain issues in terms of if there's a no-deal Brexit. And my view is that it is probably not going to be the body blow it might have been in previous times. And I think that a lot of the pain has already been taken on that basis.
Okay. I think a really interesting question that's just come in from Alan. Do you think the government will consider any specific steps in January 2021 for easing the tax burden of businesses with tax liabilities to April 2020? So with trade since creating significant reductions in cash flows, making the ability to sort of pay tax more challenging. So will there be any specific steps to help with that, Jeremy?
Well, the government's already taken time to pay measures and eased it. And the problem is, of course, is that businesses may not tuck that money away for a rainy day. They may be using it. So they end up, sort of a queue of tax liabilities from this year, from next year, from the year after, all concertinaing together. Which is why I always wonder that in an age of zero interest rates, if you've got the money, you might as well pay your tax, because otherwise there's a temptation to spend the money if you don't need it immediately. Don't necessarily leave it in a bank account, then spend it, and then don't have the money when the government comes knocking. I think the government will want to wean business off support, and whilst it may give further short-term measures in terms of time to pay, depending on how the economy does, I wouldn't bank on it. They got a lot this year, and sensible businesses should be thinking, well, okay, now I don't have to pay my VAT for 9 months, 12 months or something, but I will have to pay it at some point. How am I going to deal with that? How do I look at that in terms of my cash flow? Because I'll then have other tax liabilities at the same time. Okay.
Another question that's come in from Peter. It'd be useful to hear Jeremy's view on the timetable of recovery. So how much in 2020, 21 and 2022?
So I think my slide, which had the sort of the U, the V and so on, and the I, the V's, I think, coming back pretty quickly. And you'll see some recovery in the autumn. I think that the I at the other end, you'll see coming back, or well, they haven't really, they've got better and better, and they'll still carry on. I think that it's the U's, the W's, and the L's. I think entertainment 2021, we're talking about overseas tourism. 2021, maybe even not the skiing season for 2021. We'll see how that pans out after all the initial outbreak or big outbreak has been sourced to a large gathering of people in Ischgl in Austria during the skiing season. So I would say that the U, W and L, well, I think that the U and the W is sometime in 2021. That you're going to be seeing a recovery. L could be much later than that. Airlines, high streets really depends on how much support. But I don't see them recovering particularly quickly. So I think whereas the overall economy may not see some terrible figures come next year, I think there will be a recovery. I think it'll be very concentrated and patchy.
Okay. Another question that's come in from Elizabeth, and we'll put you in charge now, Jeremy. So what main tax reliefs or exemptions would you introduce to kickstart the economy?
What tax reliefs and exemptions would I put in? I think I would, number one, I would have business rate relief. I would ensure it doesn't go to warehouses. I think actually warehouses could pay a bit more. That may be unpopular, but I would be planning for 2 or 3 years where small and medium-sized businesses do not have to pay rates. I would be extending R&D tax reliefs substantially to try and encourage people to invest in tech areas, and I would be extending capital allowances. The annual investment allowance, which is £1 million, which allows you full relief, would is planned to go back to £200,000 on the 1st of January 2021. I would be extending that, if not increasing that element, to maybe £2 or £3 million for the next couple of years. That's what I would be looking at in terms of reliefs. And then I think my final relief is I would relook at enterprise zones. In terms of the enterprise zones, I might be looking at which areas are in distress throughout the nation, and maybe looking at that point at extending enterprise zones.
Okay, probably time for a couple more. So interesting question that's come in this morning. So how does the UK government financial support package compare to those of other governments? And what do you think will have been the most effective in the long term?
I haven't studied them in huge detail, but what I've seen from reports is that ours has been, you can query other elements of the UK response to coronavirus, but the economic support package was faster and more effective than in many other countries. Whether money's been wasted and in retrospect will have gone to some companies not deserving of it is another matter. But in terms of speed and amount and delivery, I think it's probably almost without equal. But I haven't studied every one in detail. Other countries, of course, have given quite generous support. But in the Eurozone, for example, they've had the problem that Italy and Spain would want to give much greater support, but because they share a currency with Germany, they haven't been able to do so far.
Okay, quick one. Do you think interest relief for residential property landlords will be abolished like the old miras? And that's from Graham.
Answer in the short term, no, because there's enough distress in that area. There are enough landlords getting no money at all, or the government's already saying you can't evict. We put a suspension on that. I think that they will want to assess the property market in more normal times before they decide to abolish it or go further with interest relief abolition. I mean, the interest relief phase down to the basic rate has already caused quite a lot of landlords to either exit the market or look to exit the market. I cannot believe that they will go further with that before having had some time to see how the current measures work, because they only came fully into force in April 2020, the full abolition for sort of higher rate relief. And landlords are suffering at the moment badly, and I can't think that the government can believe that they could put another squeeze on landlords at the moment without having a major effect on the housing market. Okay,
and I think final question now before I wrap up. There's been a couple of questions on this. So opening up equity investment to help struggling SMEs as opposed to adding more debt is a viable alternative. And there could be many willing investors who wish to help support this way rather than a hike in tax rates. And what are your thoughts on this? And how can this be initiated in a simple manner? And there's also a kind of, Graham's also asked, could equity be the new debt going forward for medium-sized businesses, so that the two tie in together?
Well, it's obviously an interesting point, because interest rates are at a historic low again. So you'd have thought debt is a little bit more attractive than it might have been in the past. Obviously, equity investment, the government has a couple of schemes which are particularly useful. The enterprise incentive scheme for companies that want to raise a considerable amount, but that's only available if the company's up to 12 years old. And there's the seed enterprise investment scheme, which gives you 50% tax relief, but that's for a very limited amount of money, £100,000. And it's for really small companies which have less than £200,000 of net assets and are, I think, up to 2 years old. The government could look at expanding EIS, allowing more established companies, investors to take advantage of more established companies and getting tax relief there. Of course, the tax relief tends to go to wealthier people because they're the people who are going to invest in these businesses. But a temporary relaxation of EIS rules could be something that they would do to kickstart that area. And I don't think that that is something that they would dismiss out of hand. My only worry is that the people who generally benefit from the EIS advantages are already the better off in society. And I'm not sure the optics will look particularly good on that basis. But that doesn't mean that they couldn't do a few measures to ease the regulatory burden on EIS and make it more attractive to a wider range of companies.
Okay, thank you, Jeremy. Well, that's all we have time for, I'm afraid. Thank you so much to all of those who've joined us. We hope you found the webinar useful. So over the course of the next few weeks, we'll be continuing our series of webinars on various topical issues. So please do continue to join us. Details will be sent to you in due course, so please keep a lookout. In addition, I just wanted to mention that we have recently launched the Interested Parties database, and that's to connect buyers and investors with potential purchases of distressed assets based on investment preference. So if you or you have clients that are interested in speaking to us about this database, please don't hesitate to get in touch with your usual Quantuma contact or drop us an email at events@quantuma.com. For any questions we didn't have time for, we apologise. We'll be sure to follow up with you individually to discuss. But lastly, thank you very much for Jeremy for taking time out of your day to share your knowledge, expertise and experience. And have a good day, everybody, and stay safe.